Hello everyone, Sidewin here. After recently making a character for a one-shot, I decided to make this video explaining the basics of Pathfinder 2e skills. I am hoping to continue this into a series on the basics of using every single skill in Pathfinder, as well as the specific actions you can use with them. But this video is mostly an overview of which each skill does, what ability score it uses, and how you can use it in a character build. This might be a little bit long, but I'm going to try and keep this relatively short for each one. The core things I'm highlighting in this video are recall knowledge access and other crucial skills for the party, as well as just the list of actions. I'll try to talk about those separately in other videos. And I'm going to go through these in alphabetical order as they are displayed on Archives and Nethys. So that means we're starting with Acrobatics. So Acrobatics is a dex-based skill, which has no recall knowledge potential in it. That's generally because its main thing is helping you move around the world easier. For example, in its actions, you have Arrest a Fall and Grab an Edge, which let you substitute for a reflex save whenever your character could be knocked off an edge. Additionally, there's Escape, like if you need to get out of manacles or rope ties or anything like that, and Bounce, like crossing a thin bridge. And other actions which basically just help you move around. If a GM wanted to give a recall knowledge ability with this, I would personally make it recognizing a certain acrobatic act or how experienced someone is with acrobatics, but in general, there isn't recall knowledge. If your character is a dex-based character who will be getting into dangerous situations, acrobatics is always a good skill to pick up, but depending on your class, it shouldn't necessarily be your first skill. For example, if you're playing an investigator, you might want to prioritize recall knowledge skills over acrobatics, although you should be able to get both. The next skill is Arcana. This is an intelligence-based skill, which is one of the 4 core recall knowledge skills. Technically, there's 5 core recall knowledge skills, but I usually narrow it down to 4 because depending on the campaign, you'll likely have one kind of fall off in its usefulness. I'll talk about that when I get to the first of those. But the Arcana skill is pretty much for wizards and similar arcane casters. I'm pretty sure wizards and most other arcane casters literally get proficiency at a base because it's required to learn spells in the arcane tradition. So if you find a spell scroll and your wizard wants to add it to their spellbook, they use Arcana to do that. Additionally, with Arcana, you can decipher writing and identify magic relating to the arcane tradition, or to series of arcane magic. And the final action, which could be useful to some parties, is Borrow Spell. Basically, if you have 2 prepared arcane casters, one of them can take the other's spellbook and attempt to prep a spell that's only in the other guy's spellbook. However, it can fail, so this isn't a fail-safe measure. It can just be a way to give a little additional variety if, say, one person has a spellbook of entirely fire spells and you're going to the elemental plane of fire, where their abilities won't be very useful. Arcana is one of the core recall knowledge skills because it allows you to recall knowledge about creatures of arcane significance. The most common example is most likely constructs, but your GM might also include other things which are based on Arcana, such as powerful spellcasters, or really just anything that wizards made. Additionally, it can be used to recall knowledge about the magical traditions themselves. This is something that is a little bit of an interesting delineation because every single recall knowledge skill associated with one of the 4 magical traditions can recall knowledge about their own tradition, but only Arcane can recall knowledge about the other traditions, although can't necessarily get too specific about it. Lastly, you can recall knowledge about certain planes of existence, namely the astral plane, the elemental planes, and the netherworld. This indicates that those creatures of arcane significance can include elementals. So if you're in a very elemental-heavy game, Arcana could be the substitution for if somebody didn't pick up the other relevant recall knowledge skills. Athletics is a skill which almost every melee martial, especially strength-based ones, should pick up. The way it works is it's similar to acrobatics and it lets you move around the world, such as if you need to escape, you can use athletics checks instead of your unarmed attack modifier. Additionally, it can let you climb up heights that you wouldn't otherwise be able to, swim across lengthy distances, and jump across gaps, or jump up a hill or a fence or anything like that. There's really no recall knowledge potential with this, but there are a number of combat actions which are easy for any, again, strength-based melee character to use. These are grapple, reposition, shove, trip, and disarm. Some of these are more commonly used than others, such as trip applying flat-footed and being especially useful if you have a rogue in the party, or shove being useful to get an enemy away from your spellcaster buddy, or grapple being able to be used to restrain. However, most of them have the limitation of you can only affect a creature one size bigger than you, sometimes two sizes, and there are feats that can modify this. Most of the athletics feats increase what your available actions can do, and do not unlock new ones. They just strengthen the existing ones. If you are playing a strength-based martial, you should nearly always take athletics, but there are other characters that can also benefit from the athletic skill. For instance, investigators can take feats to be able to use their intelligence modifier with devise a stratagem to use athletics with their intelligence modifier. And many classes can also secondarily focus into strength and benefit from having access to them, such as non-strength-based rogues or swashbucklers. Swashbucklers even have an entire subclass around athletics. So even though Dex is the main ability for those classes, you might still want athletics to give you more tactical variability. This is one of the strongest base tools in any strength-based martials toolkit, so you should always be aware of it whenever you're playing one of them. The next skill that I'm covering is crafting. Crafting is not always relevant in every single party, but it can be very relevant in certain circumstances. Its actions are repair, craft, and identify alchemy. Repair is an action which can be taken similarly to treat wounds out of combat. The way it works is it lets you restore hit points to a damaged item. The most common item you'll be doing this to is shields. So if you have a shield-based character in the party, having crafting can be very useful to extend the durability of that shield. If you're playing a shield-based character, you might want to take crafting. But if you have, say, an alchemist, which automatically gets crafting proficiency and is intelligence-based, as crafting is an intelligence skill, then you might want to leave it to them to repair your shield. However, if you do have a shield user, you nearly always want one person with the crafting skill just to fix the shields. The other two actions have slightly more limited or slightly expanded usefulness depending on your campaign. Identify Alchemy essentially lets you know what the potion you picked up in the dungeon is. It can tell you whether you have a healing potion, a poison, or anything else before somebody drinks the poison. However, it does require you to take a good deal of time to examine it. It's not a quick action, and if you get interrupted in the middle of it, you don't finish the action. The last action is Craft, which is a downtime thing where you can make new equipment. With certain feats, you extend the amount of stuff you can take. Most crafting feats extend what you can make, or extend your ability to do so. The most common one is alchemical crafting, simply due to there being two different classes which use alchemy as a base class feature. Anyone can pick it up for downtime crafting, however. Crafting is also a kind of tertiary recall knowledge skill. It's not in the core 4 or 5, depending on your campaign, and it's not really as commonly used as those 5, but it can still be useful in certain campaigns. For instance, you can recall knowledge about alchemical reactions. Maybe you can identify the bomb that's going off. You can tell what an item's value is without having to go to someone to appraise it, which can reduce the chance of your character getting tricked about the value of the loot you picked up. You can also recall knowledge about engineering, unusual materials, and alchemical and mechanical creatures. So if you're going into a wizard's dungeon, crafting can be very useful as a substitute for arcana, because maybe you have a party where nobody has arcana. Well, crafting can still let you learn a bit about the golems and constructs that are patrolling this wizard's lair. But in general, since you can only really recall knowledge about constructs of various types, it's more limited in use than arcana is. But it's still a good one to pick up for the other abilities. GMs should generally watch this crafting proficiency thing with constructs rather than just defaulting to arcana, because sometimes a character only has proficiency in one. And if you have proficiency in crafting and not arcana and are in a situation where you're fighting a lot of constructs, please remind your GM, because it's very easy to forget it on the GM side. The next skill is deception. Oddly enough, this is kind of straightforward. It's basically you're lying to someone or distracting them from being able to do things. Generally, mindless creatures are immune to deception. There's no recall knowledge potential for this because, well, you're making stuff up, not discovering things. However, the combat actions can be useful to provide support from marshals to casters because of the distracting potential. Again, it relies upon charisma, so it might not be the best choice for every melee character, but if you have a charismatic rogue or a fighter or maybe even a barbarian, you can always pick up deception as an additional option. Generally, deception feats increase the efficacy of these various options, and there's some other things they can do as well. Diplomacy is also a charisma-based skill, and the opposite of deception, it's basically just convincing someone rather than lying to them to convince them. The barrier between the two for the GM to judge is, first off, is the character lying? If they are, it's probably deception. If they're not lying, but maybe twisting the truth a little, it could be either. But if they're relying upon purely the facts and personality, it's most likely diplomacy. Generally, the heavier the character leans upon lying, the more likely it is to be deception. The actions available with diplomacy as a base are gather information, which is a downtime activity that lets you essentially listen into all the rumors around town. There's make an impression, which the goal is basically to make it so that somebody likes you. And then there's request, which is you're asking for something. Higher success on make an impression then benefits request. However, request does not just mean in all cases you get what you want. In fact, there are specific mechanics that make it so that someone dislikes you more if you ask for something ridiculous. The final action I'm going to mention is Bon Mot, which is a combat action unlocked by a feat. Diplomacy feats can unlock new actions like this, but they generally, again, improve your ability to use the other ones. There is no recall knowledge with diplomacy, but the gather information action kind of serves as a substitute, because you might not know the knowledge yourself, but you can definitely listen into rumors and maybe cajole some people into telling you stuff. In general, using diplomacy does not make someone dislike you. Unlike the next skill here, which is intimidation. This is another charisma-based skill. The distinction between intimidation and diplomacy is intimidation is relying upon threats. The differentiation between intimidation and deception is that intimidation is threatening the person directly, whereas deception is more so using lies to contort what's going on. So you could be using intimidation and deception at the same time. Like if you're impersonating a noble, you succeed, that's a deception action. But then you try to use your position, air quotes, to convince somebody that they must obey you. That might be intimidation because you're threatening them with consequences. There are two actions with the intimidation skill. The first one is coerce, which is basically you threaten someone into doing what you want. And the other one is demoralize. This is an effective martial support option, which later intimidation feats can even increase the level of potentially scaring the guy to death. Again, there is no recall knowledge potential with intimidation, but you can substitute a little bit with coerce. Like, if you know who has the information, then you can go up to them and threaten to punch them in the face if they don't tell you. Generally, this does not make people like you, though, so if you have someone with diplomacy, you might want to leave it to them. Lore skills are kind of the broadest ranging ones in the game. They're all intelligence-based, and the common characteristics are basically they're narrow, and they're based on knowledge, not ability. So every single background gives you one lore skill, and a number of ancestry feats can also give you additional lore skills, and you can kind of pick them up. They are very narrowly focused, as said before, so it's knowledge about one plane, like maybe you know about the plane of fire, rather than all planes, such as planar lore, or even many planes, such as elemental planes. You have knowledge about the fire plane. And for that reason, recall knowledge checks with lore are at a lower DC than general recall knowledge checks, done with the skills religion, arcana, nature, occultism, and society. Those are the five core ones I kind of mentioned before. The other thing you can use recall knowledge to do explicitly is earn income. Again, you get a lower DC than if you're using a more general skill. But basically, the idea is this is the knowledge you've picked up on a certain area, usually before you start your adventures. Lore's main benefit is with recall knowledge if you run into something you're very knowledgeable about, like if you have a former undead hunter in your party, they might have, say, undead lore, or lore about a specific type of undead more commonly. So if you're in their homeland and you run into a certain type of undead, they have a higher chance of knowing things about it than they would if you run into, say, a dragon far from home. And it's basically just meant to reflect that narrower base of knowledge that characters might have. Medicine is a wisdom-based skill and probably one of the most generally applicable in the game. If you do not know what other skill to pick up, medicine is nearly always a good one to grab because of treat wounds. In Pathfinder, the presumption is that parties begin combat with all characters at full health, and that's done using the treat wound action, which can be done an infinite number of times outside combat. However, after being treated, a character is immune to treat wounds from the same character for 1 hour. By taking feats for medicine, you can greatly increase the efficiency and efficacy of your medicine checks. And that 1 hour timer can be lowered to a much lower amount of time. Additionally, medicine can be used to stop certain status conditions from afflicting a character, such as administering first aid to stabilize a dying character, or treating a disease or poison someone picked up. Note that this does not remove the effect, it simply gives a person a higher chance of success on saving against it, but it can still serve a very similar purpose because that bonus can be so large if you succeed. The final thing you can use medicine for is the recall knowledge on diseases, injuries, poisons, ailments, and forensics. Generally, medicine is, again, a tertiary recall knowledge skill. It's not applicable in every case. But if, say, you have a murder mystery, medicine can be used to examine the body over a lengthy span of time and determine how they died. It can also be used essentially for, say, you fought ghouls and someone got ghoul fever, you can recall what ghoul fever is. Although remaster might have changed ghouls. It's basically just, if you don't know what to grab medicine. Your party will thank you, and a party without medicine, unless they have other methods of healing, will have a very rough time in the game. Nature is another core recall knowledge skill, and it's one of those two I said kind of shift off in usefulness depending on the campaign. Because almost every campaign will lean more towards city or wilderness. So nature and society are the two skills relating to that. Normally a campaign leans heavier on one than the other, and that's why I consider the one it leans heavier on to be the fourth core recall knowledge, and the other one to be a secondary. If your campaign goes in both, you might just want to pick up all five to have the broadest base of knowledge. But nature's main thing is, first off, you can command an animal. This doesn't always have the highest benefit of success, but you can do it. And then the identify magic and learn a spell abilities from the primal tradition. If your character is a primal caster like a druid, they nearly always want nature, and it's usually given by the class as default. The list of things nature can be used to recall knowledge about is flora, fauna, geography, weather, environment, basically anything that's in the natural world, plus knowledge about Fae and the elemental planes. So if you're in a very nature-based campaign, nature is obviously useful for recall knowledge. Occultism is the second to last recall knowledge skill I'm going to be talking about today, and it doesn't have any actions aside from the ones specifically for its tradition. Basically, just like with Arcana, you can decipher writing, identify magic, and learn a spell using occultism for the occult tradition. Identify magic is basically identifying the spell they're casting. And you can usually only use this against occult casters, but your GM might have slightly different rules. Decipher writing for occultism is interesting, and I added a bit more to highlight it, because it's not just for specifically, like, what is the spell mechanic. It's also for topics like incoherent ramblings of madman, and obscure philosophies, and mysticism in general. So basically, if something's written in a symbolist code, you can use occultism to decipher it. You don't necessarily have to use society if it's specifically a occult knowledge. For recall knowledge, occultism is useful for ancient mysteries, obscure philosophies, and the esoteric planes, as well as creatures like spirits, aberrations, and oozes. Generally, when you are in a campaign exploring ancient ruins, occultism is a good thing to have, because it's specifically about that weird stuff. Bards use occult magic, and as such, they have proficiency in occultism, if I remember correctly. So if you have a bard in the party, they will already have this, and you might instead pick up something else if it would better benefit your character. Performance is probably the least broad skill in the game. The main use of it is for the Bard class, which uses it for certain class features. Its only action is to perform, which is just you try to impress the crowd and get money from it. Or just impress them, it depends. But that's basically all there is to it. Your GM might use GM Fiat to let you recall knowledge about certain types of performance, but realistically, if you're not a bard, you're not going to have performance. Some feats can broaden its usefulness, but at the base, it's not a especially broad-ranging skill. Plus, you can sometimes use acrobatics or other skills for performance checks. And it does explicitly tell the GM that you might say someone's doing an acrobatic performance, you might require them to have acrobatics and performance proficiency to do well. Religion is the fourth divine tradition recall knowledge skill. It's automatically given to certain classes that are divinely affiliated, such as clerics and champions. And it again has decipher writing, identify magic, and learn a spell. One thing with decipher writing is that it lets you decipher the meaning of religious texts, so there can be a bit of overlap with occultism. However, in general, the way you tell the difference is religion is for more mainstream stuff, whereas occultism is for weird offshoots. Religion's recall knowledge can be on divine agents such as angels and demons, theology, obscure myths, and the distinction between obscure myths and ancient mysteries is basically, was there a time when they were commonly known? If yes, it's a myth. If no, it's probably a mystery, because mystery cults historically were insular groups that kind of shared secret rituals, knowledge, etc. Basically, think of the Freemasons. The other thing that recall knowledge religion can be done with is for planes like the Void and the Outer Sphere, basically divinely associated planes, and religiously associated creatures, which include the obvious celestials and fiends, but undead also count under this. Some GMs might put the dividing line between spirits and undead a little loose and let you recall with occultism for undead and religion for spirits, but that's very GM dependent, and some prefer to go rules as written. Society is the final skill on here that has any relation to recall knowledge. Its actions are create forgery, which basically lets you fake a document. Like if you need to get past a bridge that you have to have a pass to get across, you can write a fake pass. Additionally, it has decipher writing, specifically for coded messages, incomplete or archaic text, or sometimes, rarely, text in a language that your character doesn't know. Basically, if you are trying to catch a spy, society is a very useful skill to have. Lastly, you can use subsist in downtime to sustain yourself in a settlement, just like nature lets you do it in the wilderness. For society, it allowed you to recall knowledge on local history, important personalities, institutions, and cultures. Usually, all of these are restricted to humanoid cultures, but your GM might let you recall knowledge on non-humanoid cultures with society. Some of them might up the DC because society is basically knowledge of the society of humanoids within Pathfinder's ordering of skills. Now moving on to the last few skills. Stealth is a dex-based skill, which its main thing is just sneaking around. Sneaking is when you're moving and hiding, whereas hide is hiding in a stationary location. Additionally, stealth can be used to shove an object somewhere where nobody can see it. There's no recall knowledge skill built with this skill. Survival is a little bit weird in that it has a lot of overlap with nature. But most recall knowledge that could be construed as being this skill are obviously recall knowledge using nature. What survival lets you do, though, is it lets you subsist in wilderness, just like society does in society. And then it also lets you determine what direction you're heading, it lets you hide your tracks, and it lets you track someone. It's much more useful in wilderness campaigns than in city campaigns. However, tracking and covering tracks can still be useful in some cases in urban adventures. Generally, survival is situational, but you should be aware of its existence for if you're trying to go for the wilderness, basically. The last skill is thievery. This is a dex-based skill, which is somewhat core because disarming traps is nearly always done with thievery. The only exception is some haunts require you to use occultism, religion, or a similar recall knowledge skill. Thievery does not have a recall knowledge ability associated with it, because most checks which could be construed as being done with thievery are obviously made with crafting. Basically, thievery is knowing how to take something apart, not so much knowing how it's put together. The actions given with thievery are palm an object, which is basically you take a little thing from a guy and make sure they don't notice. Steal, which is something very similar. And then disable a device and pick a lock. Disabling a device is kind of like disarm the trap. It has a fairly narrow ability span. And pick a lock is mostly used for getting out of manacles or getting into chests. In general, failing at a thievery check is a good way to blow yourself up. The rogue class is usually most closely associated with thievery, but other dex-based classes can benefit from picking it up, especially if you're in a dungeon crawl where you'll be running into a lot of traps. That is all of the core skills in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I will be making separate videos to explore them in depth. Thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful.